Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing, should the San Jose Sharks sign Mitch Marner? He will become a free agent on July 1st. It is not expected for him to re-sign with his current team, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the team that he has spent the entirety of his career with, and it is not every day that a player of Marner's caliber actually ends up hitting the open market. And so it won't be a surprise when pretty much every single team will at the very least inquire on what it would take to actually bring Mitch Marner to their respective organizations. The Sharks will definitely be one of those teams, but the real question is whether or not the Sharks will actually be willing to follow through and offer Mitch Marner a contract. The first thing that we must discuss is, what does a Mitch Marner deal actually look like? Starting off with the term, I would suspect that Mitch Marner, as with most top-tier players, will expect the full maximum 7 years. Obviously, he could get an 8th year if he remained with Toronto, but it seems as though that ship has sailed, and so every other team will be coming in with that 7-year offer. There's always the thoughts of, well, why don't the Sharks sign him for like 2 years or 3 years and pay him $17 or $18 million per season? But there's a couple of reasons for why these top-tier players don't usually go for those types of short-term contracts. The first of which is that a lot of players do value stability. And if you take a 2-year deal, that means in a couple of seasons' time, you once again have to go through this free agent frenzy. But if you take a 7-year deal, and especially a player like Mitch Marner who could easily get himself a no movement clause, that means that you now know you will be spending the next 7 years in whatever city that you chose to sign in. And for someone like Marner who has recently had a child and is looking to start a family, that could be a very important amount of stability for him in his life. On top of that, it is also very much a risk to go with these shorter deals. Yes, he could come out as a major winner if he gets $17 million per season for the next 2 years and then does that again, and then does that again, and it comes out as much more worth it than taking a 7-year deal, but you run the risk of, first of all, just getting worse as a player. As you get older and get closer to 30, and then on the wrong side of 30, you might not be worth the $17 million the next time around, and after that, you might go even lower than that, but you also risk potential big injuries that can shift the direction of your career, perhaps even make it come to an end. If the next year or the next couple of years Mitch Marner has this crazy career-ending injury, he would lose out on a ton of money. Simply just ask Logan Couture how important his 8-year deal was to him, because he was making $8 million per season. The first 4 years went rather swimmingly, but as we know now, he had a big injury that makes it so he can no longer play in the NHL. Over the final half of this contract, he will only end up playing 6 games and yet still get paid $32 million. Couture is living the good life, and Marner would probably want to follow suit. So I imagine 7 years is what we will see for this player, unless he himself is looking for something different, but I highly doubt it. And so now we must look at, well, how much money is he going to end up getting paid? There's not necessarily a ton of precedent to look at. You cannot simply just evaluate it based on how much money the other elite wingers that have re-signed with their respective teams are getting, because it is very different when you actually hit the free agent market, because you can get a bidding war going on between specific teams. Go back to 2018 with John Tavares. You can even just look at the San Jose Sharks, who were reportedly offering him $13 million per season. Was Tavares actually worth $13 million per season? Not at all, but because the Sharks really wanted to get him and beat out every other team's offer, that is what they had to go with. Now, ironically enough, he ended up signing with the Toronto Maple Leafs, but the idea is there that you will have to overpay this player almost certainly. There is one player that we can look at that was in a similar situation to Mitch Marner, was actually the year after Tavares in 2019, with Artemi Panarin. He was one of the best wingers at the time when he became a free agent, and he would end up signing a 7-year deal with the New York Rangers where he got paid $11.6 million. So just from that, we can suspect that Mitch Marner will make no less than that $11.6 million. But those are not contracts that will be treated equally, because $11.6 million these days is very different from where it was 6 years ago. Instead, you actually have to look at percentage of the salary cap for these contracts. In going into the 1920 season, the salary cap was $81.5 million, and so Panarin's contract was 14.2% of the total salary cap value. If you were to take the equivalent these days, when the salary cap is $95.5 million, Mitch Marner would end up having to have a deal of $13.6 million, which seems a little bit more accurate to what he probably will end up getting. Perhaps It could come lower than that if he wants to sign with a competitive team, one that will maybe have to squeeze him into their current salary cap situation. Think a Florida or a Vegas, especially when you consider the tax situation. It is certainly possible that Marner goes in that direction, but for a team like San Jose, where he's not going to be looking to do them any favors, you probably have to get to about $13.5 million to even start the conversation of bringing Mitch Marner over to the Sharks. The next question here is, well, is Mitch Marner actually worth that amount of money? Well, this year Mitch Marner was incredible during the regular season. 81 games played, 27 goals, 75 assists for 102 points. This was good for 5th in scoring in the entire league. To put that into perspective, when Artemi Panarin signed his $11.6 million contract back in 2019, he was one of the best wingers in the entire league, but he was only 18th in scoring. That is a far cry from being top 5 like Mitch Marner was. But it is not just that Marner is fantastic offensively. That is, not unusual for a top flight winger in the league, but he is also good defensively. That much is more rare. Marner can do it all on both sides of the puck. In fact, the Frank J. Selke Trophy was just awarded a couple of days ago to Alexander Barkov. No surprise there. This is the trophy given to the league's best defensive forward, but Mitch Marner actually finished 7th in voting, and so he's considered to be, at least this year, the 7th best defensive forward in the entire league. So he will play in all situations for you, including on both the power play and the penalty kill. That is extremely valuable. So if he's very good offensively and very good defensively, what's the catch? What's the downside here? Is there even one for this player? Unfortunately, there is, because all of this applies beautifully to him in the regular season. It's all sunshine and rainbows there, but it is the postseason that brings a lot more pause. Now, on paper, it certainly doesn't look too bad. 13 games played, 2 goals, 11 assists for 13 points. He managed to maintain his point per game pace. Obviously, it was a step below where he was at in the regular season, but that can be expected. It's not an unusual scenario that a player will drop off in scoring going into the postseason, because in the playoffs, teams just score less goals. It's natural that that will happen. But when you take a bit of a deeper look, this is where you get to be somewhat of an issue. First of all, the goal scoring is not as much there as you would hope for. Just 2 goals in 13 games is not particularly good. And if you look at his career, he's got 63 points in 70 games, only 13 goals. Just not something that you want to be seeing out of a player like Mitch Marner, who's not necessarily a scorer, but he's got a pretty good shot and is just not making use of it enough in the postseason. But the bigger issue is that a lot of Mitch Marner's scoring is actually front-loaded in these playoff series, and this year was a prime example of that. In the first round, the Toronto Maple Leafs faced off against the Ottawa Senators. It was a 6-game series. The Leafs zoomed out to a 3-0 series lead early on. Mitch Marner had 6 points over those first 3 games, but in the final 3 games, when the Leafs were just looking to close out the series, Marner had just 2 assists. Not terrible, but definitely not all that great. But it was the series next against the Florida Panthers where it was truly apparent. In the first 3 games, the Leafs had a 2-1 series lead. Mitch Marner put up 4 points during that time period, but in the final 4 games, the key games in a series that the Leafs would ultimately end up losing, Mitch Marner had just 1 assist coming in Game 6. This includes a Game 5 in which the Leafs were beat up at home, and a Game 7 where they were once again beat up at home. And this is not an unusual circumstance for Mitch Marner. This was his 7th career do-or-die, winner-take-all game, mostly a Game 7 scenario. The Leafs and Mitch Marner have lost every single one of those, and during those 7 games, Marner has 0 goals and just 2 assists. If you're paying a player $13.6 million and making him one of the highest paid players in the entire league, you need to be able to rely on them to be a superstar in Game 1 of the regular season and in Game 7 of a playoff series, no questions asked, and Marner has not been able to do that, at the very least, for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And so, not having that clutch factor, there's a risk in investing so much money into that particular type of player. And so if we move on now to the final major question here, will the San Jose Sharks want to sign Mitch Marner? Well, it does come with some consequences, not necessarily negative ones, but ones that must be considered. First of all, By signing Mitch Marner, you kind of set the standard financially for the San Jose Sharks. He would immediately come in and be the Sharks' best player, so it certainly makes sense for him to be the highest paid player on the team. But right now, prior to Mitch Marner coming in, the current best player on the Sharks is Macklin Celebrini, and you expect him to continue to grow into that role. This is an extremely promising young talent, 18 years old, already doing some incredible things in the NHL. You think he's going to be the future captain, the future superstar in the NHL. It is possible that he could even eclipse the performance of a player like Mitch Marner. And so in a couple of years, when his entry-level contract is up, usually maybe you're trying to set the ceiling with him at $11, maybe even $12 million. But if Marner is hanging around with his 13.6, perhaps Celebrini will look to match or maybe even pass that in dollar values. We only actually have to look at Mitch Marner's former team, the Toronto Maple Leafs, to see a scenario having played out there. The Leafs signed John Tavares back in 2018, $11 million per season. The very next year, Austin Matthews, their superstar first overall talent, his entry-level contract ran out, and he ended up signing for $11.6 million, notably more than what John Tavares was making. And it is not as though that the 3 entry-level years that he had put up were so outstanding to have demanded that type of money, but because he was viewed as that future player, that future number 1 guy, captain material of Toronto, the Leafs ended up giving him that higher contract to make him the highest paid player on the Leafs. I'm not saying that this will play out exactly like that with Celebrini, but you do run the risk of it happening when you bring in a player like Mitch Marner, who is making so much more than everybody else. The other thing that a Mitch Marner signing would do is heavily accelerate the Sharks' rebuild. There was a quote this season from Mike Grier where he talked about how tempting it could be to try and really press the acceleration on this rebuild to get it going faster, but that he feels you kind of have to let it play out. Well, a signing of Mitch Marner would absolutely put this into the next gear for this team, because right now the pathway for the San Jose Sharks is pretty smooth. This next season, 25-26, you're expecting the Sharks to have some notable improvements, definitely try to jump up in the standings, but maybe be in that closer to like 6th or 7th last range. Then in 26-27, they step up more. Maybe they're that bubble type of team, perhaps finishing close to where the Utah Hockey Club were this season at around 80 points. And then 27-28, you're hoping to be that wildcard spot. A Mitch Marner signing, you're moving that window forward by an entire year. Perhaps you're not making the playoffs immediately next season in 25-26, but you expect to do that the very next year. And for the Sharks to actually be able to pull that off, there will have to be moves made, and certain young players and prospects will end up falling by the wayside. This is not necessarily a negative thing. It could be spun as a positive thing to get the Sharks back into the playoffs sooner, but it is certainly a different path than the Sharks are currently on, and Mike Grier will have to view of whether or not that is the correct choice. The final thing, of course, is that Mike Grier, he wants a certain type of player. Obviously, when I usually talk about like the wingers that Mike Grier is looking to bring in, it's guys with size, but when you have a true difference maker like Mitch Marner, that you can make an exception for. However, Mike Grier also wants proven winners. He wants guys who, when the going gets tough and the chips are down, that they will be able to will their team over the finish line. And what we have seen with Mitch Marner in his entire career with the Toronto Maple Leafs is that he's just not that type of guy. Now, the saving grace for Mitch Marner is that this season we saw him participate at the Four Nations with Team Canada, and he did have some pretty clutch moments there. He scored a key overtime game winner in the round robins against Team Sweden, and he also had the primary assist on the tournament-winning goal from Connor McDavid in the final game against Team USA. So outside of that Toronto Maple Leaf spotlight, but actually in a tighter and higher pressure situation with Team Canada in that finals, he was able to get it done. So perhaps being that like hometown hero, he's from the area, playing in Toronto, the center of the hockey universe, all the pressure on him, all the conversations being had in the media, that has put Mitch Marner in a tougher spot, and going to a lower pressure environment like San Jose could benefit him and unlock his potential in the playoffs. But at the same time, betting $13.6 million that that's going to be the case and that he'll somehow turn things around with a change of scenery, it's an extremely risky scenario. And so really the theme here of this video thus far is that signing Mitch Marner, it is definitely a risk for the San Jose Sharks. And so if I were the GM of the team and I had to make that choice, I probably would decide against it. If you could get it for a good deal, maybe in like the $12 million range, it may very well be worth it. But if I'm correct and I suspect he falls closer to $13.6 million, it does feel that is a little bit too rich. And with the type of player he is, I imagine Mike Grier may very well agree with me. And this probably won't end up playing out. Class dismissed.